There's one part of the brain called the hippocampus that's damaged by stress. It does terrible stuff. Here's why spousal abuse goes up. Here's why people stop trusting each other. Here's why crime increases and people drink themselves to death more often. And then I get to say, and yeah, here's what happens on the neuro.
Dr. Robert Sapolsky is a world-renowned neurobiologist and primatologist who has spent 40 years studying the devastating effects of stress, violence, morality, and what it really means to be human. And he's here to dismantle the illusion that you're in control.
There's no room for free will. Free will doesn't make sense intellectually. It doesn't make sense ethically. You know, every now and then I go into prisons. I remember this one time, like after I did one of these talks, this guy came up to me. He said, you know, all this stuff you're saying, I have this older brother and he's a vice president of a bank. And look at me. And we got raised in the same home. And
Wow.
if you'd been 5 inches taller and your motor cortex was this way instead of that, and you lucked out and that person was walking by that day, that would have been you.
The Icons is a show where we learn life lessons from true icons. And today we dive deep into the world of stress, free will, and what's really in control of our lives. Dr. Robert Sapolsky, welcome to the Icons.
Robert, when you meet somebody new, how do you introduce the work that you do?
I say that I'm a lapsed neurobiologist / primatologist.
My understanding is you spent 25 summers with some primates, did you not?
Yes. Actually, fortunately, I was able to stretch it out to 33 of them. You know, I've kind of had a dual career. 9 months of the year, I've been a neurobiologist in a lab coat and pipettes and all that sort of thing. And over that stretch of time, every year I would spend 3 months in the Serengeti in East Africa studying a population of baboons and the same animals going back to year after year. So a very skating on thin ice, switching back and forth between professions.
I can imagine. And so for those who would be, totally new to this topic or what you do, how would you explain it to a 20-year-old?
In my lab, I have studied what stress does to the brain. And, just to cut things short, for 40 years of work, it does bad things to the brain. It turns out, whoa, big surprise, are they sure? But trying to figure out what exactly is going on there. And with the baboons, what I've done is try to look at, if you're a baboon, what your rank, your social status, your personality, etc., have to do with how well your body deals with stress. So the lab stuff was almost entirely depressing as hell, of just telling like how your brain falls apart. Whereas the field work was maybe trying to find something a little bit encouraging about stress management.
Because I had a chance to watch some of your Stanford lectures, and first off, what strikes me immediately is just how amazing of a teacher you are. It brings these concepts that feel like they're we know people do the work, but it's hard to really understand the work sometimes. And you had a way to kind of really bring it to a place that I could make sense of it. And you had this amazing perspective, and I'm hoping I'm going to get this right, but you would look at behavior and you almost then start to travel back in time and try to understand, a second before or an hour before or 3 days before or 40 years before, what was happening that might have impacted that behavior. Am I getting it right?
Exactly. And this is in the sense, somebody does something, it's wonderful, it's appalling, it's ambiguously in between. And what do? We say, whoa, why did they do that? And why did they do that? Because of something that happened with their neurons a fraction of a second ago. And because of something in the environment that stimulated those neurons to do that 30 seconds ago, and because of this morning's hormone levels, and because of what traumas or wonderful things have happened to you in the last decade that have rebuilt your brain. Back to adolescence and childhood, and amazingly fetal life or fetal environment has a huge amount to do with who you are today. And then it's genes and what cultures your ancestors invented and what sort of ecosystems they lived in, because that had a lot to do with what cultures. Where do cultures come in? Because within minutes of birth, your mother was mothering you in a way that reflected the culture your ancestors invented back when. And, finally, evolution at the bottom of the barrel. So to make sense of where we're coming from, everything from 2 milliseconds ago to millions of years, because we're the end product of all of that.
Wow. I mean, and it's almost this traveling between subjects to figure out like what's the cause. I find that was really interesting. Was a lot of people will look at it from a biological perspective or from a historical perspective, but you kind of jump between subjects. How did you know to do that? Why did your research lead you there?
Well, I think it reflects that I've never been able to decide if I'm a neurobiologist or a primatologist. And you do the neurobiology stuff, you spend your time, palling around with molecular biologists and see tiny microscopic things and get exposed to a number of those, neurology and such. And you do the baboon stuff. And over the decades, more and more, I wind up talking to like public health people and sociologists and psychiatrists and things. So I think between the two spreads, I think I've stumbled into a wider view of things. The key thing really, after a while, is, oh my God, you got to take a multidisciplinary approach. And after a while, all of them merge into one discipline. In that, for example, you're talking about, what do genes have to do with behavior? By definition, you're talking about the millions of years during which those genes evolved. And by definition, you're talking about what was happening to you when you were a fetus, because those genes were being programmed then. And by definition, you're talking about what genes were activated in your brain, during breakfast today. And when you look at how those work, it just turns into one big arc of biology interacting with environment. So it even stops being separate disciplines after a while.
I mean, it sounds incredibly complicated, which makes sense, right? We're complicated people. And a lot of it feels like at the end of it ends up in a neuron in the brain. And so if you could implant like one idea or one thing in somebody's brain to help them improve their life, what would it be?
Oh, I don't know. I would say two things just to cheat. I'd say first one is keep in mind whatever is rewarding and wonderful and sets off fireworks in you today, by tomorrow is going to feel like what you deserve. And by 2 days from now isn't going to be enough. Just be on guard at like how quickly stuff habituates, and what we're left with is the more we eat, the hungrier we get.
Wow. I think, there's a lot in that.
I certainly experience that all the time. Oh, if only I could go back and do whatever for the first time. And we do some very fancy stuff with our human brains, which get us into trouble in that way. Our brains are really, really good and fast at habituating to nice stuff.
So that's the first thing. You said you were going to cheat and do say two things. What's the second?
I think the second is when you really look at, neurobiology of a second ago and cultural whatever, the gazillion year, and you put all those pieces together, it's clear we're extremely fancy biological machines, made out of the same stuff as like sea slugs are made of. And when you really think that through, all we are is the outcome of like the luck that's been dumped on us. And thus, none of us are entitled to anything more special than anybody else, because none of us have earned anything that we have that's actually like leading us to think there's something morally cool about us.
And that touches a little bit on this idea of free will, which I know that you talk about and think about and do research on. What's the implications when it comes to free will?
Well, when you put, again, all those pieces together, and I've been like thinking this way since I was a teenager, the conclusion is we're nothing other than the biology, which we had no control over, and its interactions with environment, over which we had no control either. And you put all those pieces together, and there's no room for free will. Free will doesn't make sense intellectually. It doesn't make sense ethically, because what believing in free will does is it lets you say, whoa, some people like you and me, some people wind up being treated way better in life than average because of stuff they had nothing to do with. And all sorts of folks get treated way worse because of stuff they had nothing to do with. And then insult to injury, we just blather on about how this is a just world. And like, we make choices, we have free will, we have agency. And if you really follow through the logic of that, which I'm able to do like for 2 minutes every month or so, blame and punishment never make sense as moral goods. Praise and reward never make sense. Hating somebody makes as much sense as like hating a hurricane or a virus that's good at getting into your lungs. And again, none of us had anything to do with how we got wired up from a lifetime ago or a second ago. None of us really should be able to get away with thinking that we can cut to the front of the line.
I mean, I can feel my brain going in all sorts of directions from that. And it pushes and pulls. I mean, in certain ways it feels like it makes sense. In certain ways it feels like it makes the opposite of sense. And I think that, where's the edge of that idea of free will? Like, how much are we hardwired versus how much can we lead our own life or make our own decisions?
Great. As soon as you try to convince people, usually unsuccessfully on my part, that there's no free will, they freak out over, oh, great, you're going to have murderers running around the streets, or everybody will run amok if that happens, or do I not deserve my cool salary and advanced degrees and feeling pretty proud of myself? But what people then always get around to is, oh, great, what are you saying? There's no free will, nothing can change? The whole universe was set 1 second after the Big Bang, and nothing can change, parentheses, so don't bother trying. More parentheses, don't bother trying to help someone else to change. And that's completely not the case. People change, societies change, biological machines change. The key thing to recognize is we don't sit there and choose to change. We are changed by experience as a function of who we turned out to happen to be at the time we have that experience. I don't know, you go, two people go to some movie. It's some inspirational movie about some underdog or whatever. And the first person comes out of the experience changed. They change their behavior. They say, oh my God, that was such an amazing inspirational story. I'd never heard about that. I'm going to go read up more about that tomorrow. And the second person comes out and they're changed, and it's going to change their behavior. And they say, oh my God, that was the most appalling cinematography. I am going to make a list of every movie that guy has made and never go to one of them again. Whoa, you suppose they were two different people when they went into that experience? They've both been changed. Neither of them went in saying, I'm going to come out of this beforehand loathing the cinematographer or being inspired. Yeah, change happens. And I guess the thing that's most interesting about it, we're just like a sea slug. We're made out of the same parts. And we really are. It's the same blueprint and like everything living thing out there. But the key difference is we're the only biological machines who can know that we are biological machines and begin to learn where the buttons are and where the levers are and where the dials are and what sort of circumstance do the dials tend to go this way versus that way. And if you have the efficacy to make sure you don't go that way and go this way instead, because of the efficacious person you did or did not turn out to be. But yeah, we know that we have buttons and levers and we can make use of that.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I appreciate you really like pulling out change as a word in terms of like, how does that fit in this? That change is possible. It happens. It's part of the process, but oftentimes it is because of a button being pushed or a lever being pulled or something that's been somewhat built into us over, or not just somewhat, I mean, fully built into us over. Yeah. No, I can almost feel myself making sense of that as you're going through it.
Which is really unsettling. Or there's a whole literature on how judges have absolutely no objectivity when they're making their decisions because of biology, and it's totally interesting stuff. And, one particular demonstration of it, of how like judges wind up being 99% to make this sort of decision in this circumstance. And I was like lecturing to a bunch of federal judges about this once, and they were like not particularly thrilled about this. And one of them said, well, I understand what you're saying, but say last week I had this case where like by the end of the day, I was sure the decision I was going to make, and it was along the lines of the standard thing. And that evening I said, hey, maybe this guy had this thing that he experienced that I have no idea about, but like, I don't know his perspective. And I thought about it for a while and I changed my opinion. Are you telling me I didn't show agency? And I said, how'd you turn out to be the sort of person who values introspection? How'd you turn out that when you introspect and decide you actually are making the wrong decision, you should do this instead? You don't get so ego freaked out that how'd you turn out to be the sort of person who thinks about that evening instead of like watching 90 Day Fiance or something? How'd you wind up? And that's how'd you wind up being the sort of person who could learn where your buttons are, who at some circumstances have wound up having the self-discipline to push this button instead of that one? How'd you wind up like being able to do that instead of spending your day trying to get enough firewood and clean water to survive another night? How'd we wind up here?
I mean, I can feel it in myself. It does get to an ego level, and not necessarily like look at me ego level, but just an idea of like who I think I am as I start to have these layers seep into me.
And the most intuitively obvious thing we got on Earth is that somewhere in there's a me who's not made of that biology stuff. Yeah, it's like surrounded by all this yucky chemicals and things, but there's a me that has an essence that's separate of it. And that's like 16th century dualism. There is no me inside the machine. There's only the machine, and out of it comes me. And that's like unsettling as hell. And again, once a month, I can really function thinking that way. Most of the time, this is like too unsettling, and you work by reflex. And if you were to say to me, oh, what an incredibly wonderful haircut you have, like I won't be able to stop myself afterward for 3 or 4 seconds. I will think, oh, what can I say? I'm a better human because of my wonderful haircut or whatever. This is not easy to do. And part of it is, taking steps away from things and being able to look at our machineness is pretty damn difficult.
Yeah, I think this is the teaching part that I was mentioning. I feel like I came in with all these questions, and I'm just being fascinated by what you're describing, and I find myself going into new places that I wasn't thinking I was going to go into. I can almost see how you start to pull different categories together, different ideas, perspective, different cross-functional kind of perspectives to get where you've gotten to.
Yeah, because they kind of dribble over into each other.
They do.
And, it might take some work to decide I'm not a morally superior human because somebody likes the sweater I'm wearing or something. But for 8 years now, but at the very most 2 months, there's been this really difficult challenge, which is all we are is the outcome of what made us. And hating somebody is like hating a tornado, and kind of hating what they're doing to our country. And more importantly, you can hate what they're doing to your country, although hate tends to just get you frothy and distracted. But hating them, and like, it's been this exhausting process for 2 months of saying, wait a second, they did not become that way by chance. Working through that. And then the much more pragmatic thing of stop thinking about that, because all that does is like soak you in helplessness, or like just spending your time boiling your stomach over like what rotten human beings they are and how much you want to twist their noses off. And step one, oh, how'd they become that way? They had nothing to do. Step two, stop thinking about that. Do something about what the hell they're doing to this or that. But yeah, the being able to step back and objectively say, well, they didn't come from nowhere. So like that's been a real challenge. I've been up against my beliefs pretty viscerally strongly for a while now.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder how much of the world needs to really investigate what you were just describing there and see themselves within it. It's just such a fascinating time. And if you take it down to, again, that 20-year-old, that person sitting on a couch right now who's looking at themselves saying, okay, if this is the case, if I am this biological machine, but I want to get better, what would you tell them?
Obviously, it depends on who they are. And one version of it, if they're sitting there in my Stanford classroom, a lot of what I would be telling them is there's nothing special about you. You see all the people sitting around you and how you all have similar backgrounds. And let's go look at the 20-year-olds in East Palo Alto in the prison there and see how they went. You know, you didn't earn this. There's nothing special. And if it's somebody instead, 20-year-olds sitting in that prison because they were already like fetal alcohol soaked by the time they were a third trimester fetus and everything else, I would say, you just had unbelievably crappy luck and nothing more than that. And it was unbelievably crappy luck that you weren't able to do anything about your crappy luck, because that's how it turned out for you. And this sucks and it's awful, but at the very least, don't beat on yourself and don't believe anyone who preaches to you about how you've got a rotten soul in there. It just turned out this way. And it sucks.
And there's no and then that you offer, or is it mostly really just that recognition and then each of us chooses our own and then from there?
Well, or each of us turned out to be the sort of person who could choose this or that out.
Or even to ask the question and then.
Or even not to have just gotten so bored that they spaced out while I was talking or whatever. I mean, every now and then I go into prisons near here, and they're not the really scary ones because I get too freaked out by that. Talk to them about how the brain works and all that. And I remember this one time, like after I did one of these talks, this guy came up to me, and of course my job is to say he seemed so sweet and nice and all of that, but I don't know, he did something at some point, but I don't know, he seemed like a nice guy. And he came up and he said, all this stuff you're saying, I have this older brother and he's a vice president of a bank. And look at me. And we got raised in the same home. And like, what happened? There must be something like, what? So why didn't I get it together like he did? And we talked for a while and we figured out what happened with his brother is his brother was about 5 inches taller than him and had good hand-eye coordination and just happened to be shooting baskets effectively in the shitty rundown neighborhood they were in when the right person was walking by, who was a recruiter for a fancy-ass prep school on the other side of the tracks, who gave him a scholarship. And they taught him, like, dead white male manners. And, like, he got socialized into all that. And he went off to a good college. And now he's saying, if you'd been 5 inches taller, and your motor cortex was this way instead of that, and you lucked out and that person was walking by that day and looked at you instead of looking, say, at the cute dog across the street or something, that would have been you. There's nothing, that's how it happened. which was, I don't know, certainly he didn't burst with revelation, but can I just say to him, it's because he's 5 inches taller and he was lucky one moment and like one afternoon playing basketball on a pickup game kind of thing.
When it comes to that idea of success, he was seen by the right person at the right time, having, he was taller by 5 inches and could shoot a basketball. Is there a dark side to success, whether it's something that success creates in us or something that allowed us to make it happen?
Well, it's a combination of the two things I was noting before. The first one is it's really tempting to decide you deserve some credit for your success. Jesus, you spent 4 years every Saturday night, your roommate going to get like falling down, puking drunk. And each time you said, nah, I got to do some reading. I got to do some studying. Whoa, that took a lot. I did these all-nighters or whatever version of that got you successful there. So the danger is deciding there's something special and fancy about you. But I think the other one is, I live in San Francisco and I'm down the valley there, and my kids went to a school surrounded by all sorts of Silicon Valley folks. And these would be these 50-year-old gazillionaire fathers who was one of the founders of this. And all they were doing was figuring out what's the next thing I have to do to prove I still have it. And like when they reflected, the issue, all of them, if they had any capacity for reflection, was always, when do I know that enough is enough? And it's so damn hard because you skipped all those parties, and it's so damn hard because so many people are saying, whoa, this is amazing with you. And it's so damn hard. And it's so damn hard because we're wired up to just get hungrier and hungrier. And yeah, but what did I do recently? And all these guys, you could see them, and then a subset of them whose like family life hadn't fallen apart and their kids didn't hate them or who knows what. Like they managed at some point, a subset, to do that transformation. And before you know it, they were like running some literacy project in like some bad part of California or whatever. When you look closely, they still wanted to like crush illiteracy the same way they had wanted to crush, the .com competition back when. So a lot of them were not quite getting out of it. But yeah, a subset were able to make some changes. But, I had this sort of mentor, father figure, a guy named Meyer Friedman, he was a cardiologist at UCSF Medical Center. He was the guy who in the 1950s discovered and named type A personality. Like this, yeah, he had a whole Meyer Friedman Institute at the medical center and all of that. And he lived to be 93, and he was doing research up until a week before he died.
Wow.
That sort of thing. And like he really there were a lot of similarities with my father, except he had much better luck than my father did. And he would have these, like there'd be a group of patients who would come in at this clinic there, and it would be a bunch of these son of a bitch sharks who at age 50 had just had their first heart attack. And whoa, this is a wake-up call. And thus they're in his program there. That would be like this 3-month thing, and having them go through all sorts of transformation. And like a third of them quit after the first day because like, no way. And another half of the remainders had dropped out along the way. But when it worked, it did some very impressive things. And he would always give like the opening talk to these people at the beginning of their session of this. I think it was like 90 at a time, and he'd always give, and then he handed it over to his people. And he always gave the same sort of talk, basically saying, whoa, I was such a son of a bitch. I was an awful human. I was all arrogant and impatient with the secretary. I didn't pay attention to my kids. And then I had a heart attack when I was 53, and I rethought everything, and look at me now. And I always like thought, okay, well, that's a good, that's okay. Personalize it and be willing to like indicate that you've been there and and like, okay, yeah, I was such a son of a bitch. And at his funeral, I met a 60-year-old kid who said, oh my God, he was such a son of a bitch. He really was. And he was one of those, and he was one of the lucky ones who turned out to be capable of self-reflection. So he lucked out and all those things. But yeah, you'd see like a room. I sat in for a couple of these first sessions, and there's all these like 50-year-olds who've had like 3 successful startups and have a 24,000 square foot house in, Los Altos near ground zero with Silicon, and they just had their first heart attack. And most of them were not going to change in the slightest, and like decided this guy was, oh God, like stop. Yeah, right. But every now and then he'd bring about a change. But I think sort of the theme running through there is like figure out when is enough enough.
You mentioned at the top that you focus on stress in lots of ways. I mean, that's where a lot of your work has been, and we haven't even gotten into stress. I feel like there's so many different places I want to go to, but I'm curious what you're learning about stress and whether it's based on modern society or just what you're discovering about stress.
Well, I happen to be bored with things like livers and blood vessels and stuff. So all I've thought about is the brain. It does terrible stuff. It does terrible stuff because we have weird kinds of stress. For 99% of the beasts on this planet, stress is somebody's trying to eat you, and you've got 30 seconds to run really fast, or you're really, really hungry and you have 30 seconds to run after someone else and predate them. It's like a short-term physical crisis, and everything you're doing with your body during stress is brilliant at that. And the stress response, like when you get stressed by something, almost certainly you were secreting the exact same stress hormone molecule that dinosaurs secreted when somebody was trying to eat them. I mean, it's ancient stuff, and it's all built around mobilizing energy to power your leg muscles and increase your heart rate and turn off all the silly stuff that you'll do tonight if there is a tonight. And what do? We turn on the exact same stress response, like hating your job for 20 years, or like we've invented, we primates are smart enough to have had the terrible luck of being able to be chronically stressed for psychosocial reasons. And you turn on the running away from a T-Rex physiology when you're like sitting there feeling stressed about like what's going to happen to the planet melting, and that's not what it evolved for. So an awful lot of what I've kind of focused on is in the brain, how something that's great for you for 3 minutes or maybe even 3 days winds up being a disaster. Why is it that, a good thing becomes too much of a good thing and becomes a real mess? And like what we know by now, I mean, the particular song and dance of mine was seeing that there's one part of the brain called the hippocampus that's damaged by stress. Like you were chronically stressed for decades, your hippocampus gets smaller, and it's really good for learning and memory. And so that's a problem. And like, how does that work? Which molecules? And we like eventually we're doing like gene therapy, trying to stick genes into neurons there to make them more robust. And what does that begin to explain? It's why like stress makes our brains age faster and cognition goes down the tubes. But all that we've learned in the 40 years or so since we started working on that stuff is, and here's why it does something to this part of the brain and makes you more likely to develop an anxiety disorder. And here's why it does something to this other part of the brain and make you more vulnerable to clinical depression. And this other part of the brain where it makes you make really terrible impulsive decisions in moments of stress that you're going to regret for the rest of your life while your judgment goes down the tubes. And then here's this other part of the brain, which when it's working well, is really good at viewing the world from somebody else's perspective. And that's why when you're stressed, you become more selfish, and your window of who counts as an us gets narrower. Why does empathy get damaged by chronic stress? So what was originally, ooh, you're not going to do as well in your SAT exams when you're 80 if you're chronically stressed, and here's why, this one part of the brain. It's like mood disorders, and people are crappier and meaner to each other when they're under stress. And this is where, like, you sit there and you futz around with genes and neurons and are learning this, and you talk to like health psychologists or economists, and they can say, yeah, when societies become more unequal, here's why spousal abuse goes up. Here's why people stop trusting each other. Here's why crime increases and people drink themselves to death more often. Here's the structural societal mechanisms by which, and then I get to say, and yeah, here's what happens on the neuronal level. Like, why stress makes people more worried and sadder and less focused and more likely to do stupid stuff in the spur of a moment and less kind. So, like, that's kind of the nuts and bolts neurobiology of how it gets there.
I can imagine somebody hearing this and thinking, I don't want that in my life. And I don't want to feel stressed. What would be the mistake that a lot of us are making as we try to de-stress ourselves?
Oh, given the speed of things and click of a button, and I guess you push buttons, you don't click buttons, but given all of that, time to make a change, and I really got to get things under control. It is not going to come easy. It's going to be one step forward, two steps back, whatever that is. It's going to be a slow process. Temptation is a very tempting thing. The pull of stuff that's going to pay off in 2 seconds because it feels great is a whole lot more palpable than trust me. Trust me, you're going to be glad you did this when you're elderly and senescent. Trust me, you're going to be glad you did this tomorrow morning when you're not like hungover or wondering, oh my God, what was that person's name anyway? Or any version of that. Yeah, it's not easy. We are hungry machines. We have trouble learning from our mistakes. Often when we recognize there's been a mistake, the solution we reach is do the same thing, but do it 3 times as much, because that's why it didn't work. You just weren't doing it as much. So let's do that as a coping strategy. Or like we're very, fragile, like messed up machines with a lot of foibles and vulnerabilities. And that's where people get into trouble very easily.
Part of me, as I'm hearing you speak, and I don't want to over project, I'm interpreting this, but I spent some time in a Shaolin monastery, and it was around this idea of Wu Wei, and Wu Wei is growth without growth, or action without action. And it feels like oftentimes I'm asking you about advice, what can somebody do, or what can they, and you're, offering back this kind of Wu Wei response, which feels like, you can potentially grow, but it's growth not necessarily by putting your finger on growth or by being in full charge of how this goes for you. It's got that kind of component to it. I'm not sure if that sounds correct or not.
It apparently does, and that's purely by chance. Apparently, I'm like basically separate of being, I was raised super religiously, and I'm like a vicious atheist now, but I'm also on top of it like the most unspiritual human on earth. And like I've been told this, there's nothing special about you. You're no more deserving than anyone else. Has some resemblance to this Buddhist concept of unselfing. And if I said one word more than that, I would just be winging it, because I know nothing about any of that. But apparently, there's some convergence there. And while I'm sitting here and fretting about neurotransmitters, you have the air of, I'm not surprised to hear that you spent some time doing that. Like,
And I have to be careful.
To that to you, and I
Yeah,
suspect that's done good things for you.
and I can't say one word more either. I feel like I'm just touching on something I know very little of. But I
once
wonder.
got Buddhism for Dummies, one of those books, and I was just bored out of my mind by like the fourth page and never got through it. It's somewhere.
I'm curious, Robert, do you have any daily rituals or routines?
I don't actually. I've got the long list of things I try to do every day and almost never do them, including like reflecting on why it is that I don't get done the things I think I need to do every day. Yeah, I happen to be. I stopped research. I closed my lab about 12 years ago, and which was around the time that my Kenyan work collapsed and like was done once and for all, and like totally upsetting. But damn, I got 33 years out of it. So basically, I've been sitting at home reading and writing books since then, and occasionally showing up on campus to teach a class. So I don't have much in the way of rituals other than like, okay, in the afternoon, try to go sit over there because that's where the sun is by then. So that's been a big change for me. So I have a somewhat unritualistic life because it's a little bit monastic.
And for someone who's been able to learn in so many different areas, what would you say is the lesson that's taken you the longest to learn?
If I could talk to my 20-year-old self, it would be the soundbite version would be less ambitious. But the more sensible one is go and find out really, really carefully what are the things you're going to have to give up if you want to try to do this. Like, go find out, go figure it out first. Just know that at some point you can't do everything. And every time you say yes to something implicitly or explicitly, you're saying no to a gazillion other things. I wouldn't have listened at the time, but that would be the thing I've learned most.
Wow,
it's more important in life than like getting stuff done.
Yeah, that idea of really carefully discovering what you're going to need to say no to.
And as a first step, and this is like spending my time around like 20-year-old Stanford students before getting them to think through that, if I'm like feeling pontificating and bloviating all over the place. The first thing is to convince them that they're not going to be able to do everything, because most of them have been pretty damn good at doing everything up to that point. And they've got a boyfriend or a girlfriend and they're 4.0 and they've already got a startup and they play 3 instruments and they're helping people get over Ebola virus in San Diego or who knows what. Yeah, even harder than like thinking through what's it mean that I'm going to be giving it is like, yeah, you can't have everything. That's most of us have some stage in life where we really have been able to do everything. And it's, you want to get very specialized at something. You want to get very good at something. You want to get very helpful at something. And a lot of this stuff takes a lot of work.
Mm-hmm. You've had the chance to impact millions, like literally millions of people with your teaching. What do you hope your legacy is?
Oh, I don't know. I suppose the easiest level is for have people coming away and saying, whoa, it is cool putting together complicated puzzles. But much more so, I would say, it's cool putting together complicated puzzles that have all sorts of things to do with like how life winds up feeling, like whether it's worth it or not, or God help me, shoot me for using this phrase that has to do with things like social justice. Ooh, there's a neurobiology that, oh yeah, this stuff is not only unbelievably interesting, but it really matters, like how we turn into who we are. So it would be nice if like people come away thinking that's kind of a good thing to have done. Glad he spent time trying to tell people that.
It's funny. I feel like over and over again in this conversation that almost describes my feelings so far is, whoa, isn't this fascinating to be thinking about these complicated puzzles and just to be, really being introduced to them and just touching on them. But it's been a fascinating short journey with you to explore this. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me on. I guess if to reduce that all to a soundbite, you could be both a hard-assed scientist and be compassionate. They're not remotely contradictory. So that's a good thing.
For those who want to keep listening to you, keep following your work, where can they find you?
Oh, of course, I have to say, I've got all sorts of books out there. So don't bother reading them. Buy hundreds of copies. And I started this Spotify YouTube podcast with my daughter about a year ago on people send in science, social implication type question stuff. And we tape one of these a week and do like 3 questions. So these are totally fun. But about a dozen years ago, Stanford posted one of my lecture classes. It's a series of like 28 lectures. It's on YouTube. The science is pretty obsolete now. And I taught that same class again last spring, and they taped it and we're editing now and are a few months away of putting up a updated version of that course because the science has gotten kind of old. So I don't know, you want to sit for 28 hour-and-a-half lectures and find out about how this stuff works, that's going to be up there soon.
You say it jokingly, but millions of people have. I mean, that's the fascinating part of you, helping people dig into this. Whoa, this is a fascinating, complicated puzzle. It's been an absolute joy having this conversation today, and for you pushing my brain into areas it hasn't gone for a long time. And I do recommend people listen to those lectures, whether it's version 1.0 or this 2.0 that's coming out. Thank you for joining us today.
Good. Thanks for having me on.